use of nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. Similarly, Robin Cook, who resigned as Tony Blair's foreign secretary to protest the decision to invade Iraq, wrote that Britain had maintained a fairly good record of compliance with the 2000 NPT Review Conference commitments, but its voice had been obscured by our close identification with the Bush administration and our willingness in the Review Conference to lobby for understanding of their position, that obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty are mandatory on other nations and voluntary on the U.S., the usual standard. Accordingly, Washington felt quite free, while the Review Conference was sitting, to proceed with plans to research new nuclear weapons designed not to deter, but to wage war, in contradiction to commitments the U.S. gave to the last Review Conference. On the eve of the May 2005 conference, Thomas Graham, Clinton's special representative for arms control, warned that the NPT has never seemed weaker or the future less certain. If the treaty should fail, he suggested, a nuclear nightmare world may become reality. Like other analysts, Graham recognized that while the other nuclear states share responsibility, the primary threat to the NPT is U.S. government policy. The NPT may not have breathed its last, but the May 2005 conference was a serious blow. So we march on, following our leaders toward an Armageddon of our own making. Chapter 3. Illegal, but legitimate. The hideous crimes of the 20th century led to dedicated efforts to save humans from the curse of war. The word save is no exaggeration. It has been clear since 1945 that the likelihood of ultimate doom is much higher than any rational person should be willing to tolerate. These efforts to end war led to a broad consensus on the principles that should guide state action, formulated in the United Nations Charter, which in the United States is the supreme law of the land. The Charter opens by expressing the determination of the signatories to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. The scourge of war had threatened not just untold sorrow, but total destruction, as all the participants knew, but refrained from mentioning. The words atomic and nuclear do not appear in the Charter. The post-war consensus on the use of force was reiterated in a December 2004 report by the UN High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenges, and Change, which included many prominent figures, among them Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor for Bush I and has a long record in the military and security apparatus. The panel firmly endorsed the principles of the Charter. Force can be lawfully deployed only when authorized by the Security Council, or under Article 51 of the Charter, which permits the right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations, until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. Article 51 is commonly interpreted with sufficient latitude to allow the use of force when the necessity of self-defense is instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, no moment for deliberation, in Daniel Webster's classic phrase. Any other resort to force is a war crime, in fact, the supreme international crime, in the words of the Nuremberg Tribunal. The high-level panel concluded that Article 51 needs neither extension nor restriction of its long-understood scope, and should be neither rewritten nor reinterpreted. The UN World Summit in September 2005 reaffirmed that the relevant provisions of the Charter are sufficient to address the full range of threats to international peace and security, specifically the authority of the Security Council to mandate coercive action to maintain and restore international peace and security, acting in accordance with the purposes and principles of the Charter and the role of the General Assembly in this regard, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Charter. The summit further endorsed the responsibility to commit ourselves, as necessary and appropriate, to helping states build capacity to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and to assisting those which are under stress before crises and conflicts break out. The summit granted no new right of intervention to individual states or regional alliances, whether under humanitarian or other professed grounds. The report of the December 2004 UN High-Level Panel went on to say that for those impatient with their conclusion about Article 51, the answer must be that, in a world full of perceived potential threats, the risk to the global order and the norm of non-intervention on which it continues to be based is simply too great for the legality of unilateral preventive action, as distinct from collectively endorsed action, to be accepted. Allowing one to so act is to allow all. Universality. The panel is presupposing the principle of universality, perhaps the most elementary of moral truisms. The principle, however, is flatly rejected in the elite intellectual, moral, and political culture of the most powerful states, again raising the prospect of terminal catastrophe, of which prominent analysts warn. Formally, the post-war consensus on the principles governing the use of force remains in effect. It is, however, revealing and disturbing to see how the spectrum of opinion has shifted in Western elite sectors. While the consensus is not usually rejected explicitly, though sometimes it is more likely to be ignored, taken to be too extreme to consider, and drifting to the margins of public discussion and electoral politics. This departure from the post-war consensus was forcefully articulated in the last years of the millennium, when a claim resonated across a broad political spectrum for Clinton's foreign policy, which had entered a noble phase with a saintly glow, creating a deep ideological divide between an idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity and an old world equally fatalistic about unending conflict. For the first time in history, a state, the idealistic New World, was observing principles and values, acting from altruism and moral fervor, while leading the enlightened states. It was therefore free to resort to force for what its leaders determined to be right. These quotes are a small sample of an extraordinary deluge, drawn only from respected liberal voices. After several years of such flights of self-adulation, probably without historical precedent, a few events were brought forth as evidence for the pronouncements, foremost among them the 1999 NATO bombing of Serbia. It was with regard to that action that the phrase, illegal but legitimate, was coined. The discussion of Article 51 by the high-level panel appears to have been both a response to the enthusiastic support by Western intellectuals for resort to violence that they determined to be legitimate, as well as a direct retort to the Bush doctrine of anticipatory self-defense, articulated in the National Security Strategy of September 2002. The high-level panel's discussion, therefore, takes on unusual significance, even apart from the fact that it reaffirms the stand of the world outside what the West calls the international community, namely itself. Consider, for example, the declaration of the South Summit in 2000, the highest-level meeting ever held by the former non-aligned movement, accounting for 80% of the world's population. Surely, with the recent NATO bombings of Serbia in mind, the declaration firmly rejected the so-called right of humanitarian intervention. The declaration, which also provided a detailed and sophisticated analysis of neoliberal globalization, was ignored apart from scattered derision, a standard reaction to the bleatings of the unpeople of the world. To borrow the phrase of diplomatic historian Mark Curtis, in the latest volume of his predictably ignored, chronicle